The ancestor of everything. It is difficult to find common traits between an elephant and a tick without an electron microscope. However, based on Richard Dawkins' explanation in his book, The Selfish Gene, the bulk of their differences can be attributed to one factor: selfish genes. Furthermore, the elephant and the tick share a common ancestor. That common ancestor materialized 3 to 4,000 million years ago and began replicating itself, striking a chain of evolution that has led to everything alive today. Its manifestation happened by chance, and was followed by an evolution based on natural selection, and eventually an evolution based on natural selection at the level of the selfish gene, that has made the diverse array of sexually reproducing species what they are today. The ancestor of everything came to be by chance, and multiplied. The molecule started out as a large organic molecule in our oceans that could make copies of itself. Because of its chemical properties, chemicals that surrounded it in the Earth's murky oceans and matched the chemicals of which it was composed, bonded to it. When it had a copy of each of its chemicals bonded to it, making up a second copy of itself, it would release the second copy. Richard Dawkins calls these self-replicating molecules replicators. Today, all living things that have evolved from our replicator ancestors contain DNA, so it is reasonable to suspect that the original replicators were DNA. Because there was an abundance of the particles with which the replicators replicated themselves, they multiplied quickly, filling the oceans with their descendants. Because the replication was not perfect, the replicator's descendants were not all exact copies of the original. Mutations in replication occurred and accumulated, creating a diverse array of self-replicating organisms. The replicators that lived the longest, reproduced the most frequently, and made the least mistakes in replication, naturally became the most numerous. Eventually, the seas were home to so many replicating molecules that the particles that they used in order to replicate were no longer abundant. Many strains of replicators died out due to lack of the replication materials. The strains that survived did so, again, because they lived the longest, reproduced the most frequently, and made the least mistakes in replication. However, now they also needed an advantage for finding replication materials. One early advantageous trait was the ability to chemically dissolve other replicators in order to use their parts for themselves. Another advantage was to form protective shells around themselves. These advantages were attained by chance, via an accumulation of mutations. Slowly, all of the strains of replicators which had not built protective coats, or survival machines, as Dawkins calls them, died off, and, because of mutations, the survival machines that the cells built around themselves became more and more elaborate. The evolution of the replicators and their survival machines was due to natural selection at the level of the whole organism. When a replicator was not good enough, it died and all of its genetic material was lost. When replicators began to reproduce sexually, natural selection began to occur at another level, the level of the gene. A gene is a portion of DNA which is responsible for a particular trait or process in an organism. This change in natural selection had to do with the process of sexual reproduction at a molecular level, during which each organism passes on only half of its DNA to its offspring. Passing on of the genetic material happens when the two chromosomes of an organism containing genetic material, one being from the organism's mother and one being from its father, are cut up and combined to form one chromosome with one copy of each gene. This crossing over of the chromosomes occurs randomly, so any given gene of an organism has a 50% chance of being present in its offspring. Crossing over causes shuffling of the genes between organisms, which accelerates the evolution of the species because it changes the DNA every generation. It is because of the shuffling of genes with those of others that natural selection began to happen at the level of the gene. Natural selection at this level occurs between genes of an organism in the same way as it occurred between strains of asexual replicators. A sexually reproducing organism with a gene for a protective shell will be advantaged, enabling it to reproduce more than a less advantaged organism. Conversely, because of sexual reproduction with natural selection on the level of genes, if the same cell is slightly disadvantaged by having a gene that causes it to be blue, making it soak up too much heat, its advantageous gene can potentially be passed on to offspring without the bad gene being passed on. The organisms that it reproduces will have only a 50% of its genetic material, and therefore a 50% chance of receiving each of the genes. Its ancestors who carry the good gene alone will reproduce more than the others, spreading the good gene, whilst those who carry the bad gene will be less successful and eventually die off. Comparatively, in a non-sexually reproducing organism with the same good and bad gene, both genes can eventually die off with the species because, together, their net advantage is small. Because sexually reproducing organisms' genes are constantly being mixed up, it is possible for an organism to pass on only some of its genes, and it is the genes that are reproduced the most that are the most successful and prevalent. Whereas, in asexual organisms, the whole organism must be successful in order for it to be successful and prevalent. The genes that have, over the years, been the most successful are the ones that are carried in our cells today. They are the result of the steps that a small organic molecule has taken since its conception, in its journey to, essentially, take over the world. Its genetic material, changed by years of mutation and generation after generation of being mixed around in the gene pool of sexually reproducing species, lives on in us all, immortal.